Welcome, beloved anointed ones. They mastered the game of survival, but you mastered the game of self. Let that sink in for a second, because that's where everything changed. Their power came from pain. Every rule they made, every strategy they used, every manipulation they performed was trauma wearing a suit. They built entire relationships, workplaces, and even family dynamics out of wounds they refused to heal. You, on the other hand, started playing from something they could never counterfeit: wholeness. Here's a fact that'll twist your mind a little. Studies show that unhealed trauma can literally rewire the brain's perception of safety, meaning some people only feel alive when chaos is present. That's right. To them, peace feels threatening and dysfunction feels like home. So, when you walked in calm, grounded, and spiritually hydrated, they looked at you like you were speaking a foreign language, because you were the dialect of alignment. They were experts at playing emotional chess with broken pieces. They baited, gaslighted, guilt-tripped, and expected you to fold under pressure because that's what trauma-trained minds do. But you showed up with a different software. You weren't operating on the coding of pain anymore. You were running on the upgraded system of awareness. No glitches, no emotional malware. And that's when the game stopped being fun for them. Because when someone plays from wholeness, manipulation becomes boring. You stopped reacting to their chaos, and that made you unpredictable. You stopped competing for validation, and that made you powerful. You stopped needing closure, and that made you free. You were never trying to win their game. You were busy changing the arena. And let's be honest, it's kind of poetic that the same people who thought they could play you ended up getting outplayed by your peace. They were gaming from trauma. You were playing from truth. And truth doesn't bluff. Now let's break this down, point by point, and uncover how your wholeness became their undoing. Number 1, they built a battlefield out of brokenness. Everything they did was born from a place that hadn't healed. Their need to control, to compete, to dominate, to belittle. It wasn't intelligence that made them strategic. It was pain wearing armor. When people never deal with their wounds, they turn them into weapons. That's what they did. They made pain their playbook, and the rules were simple. Whoever bleeds first loses. But you changed the dynamic because you didn't show up bleeding, you showed up whole. They were fighting from memory, but you were moving from awareness. Their world only makes sense when everyone is hurting. They need others to match their chaos so they can justify staying broken. When you didn't take the bait, you confused them. You didn't play the emotional games they were trained to play, the guilt trips, the silent treatments, the emotional blackmail. You weren't reacting to their storms anymore because you had already found your calm. And when someone operates from peace in a world addicted to drama, it's like bringing light into a room full of people who only know how to navigate in darkness. They can't see straight anymore. Your wholeness exposed what they didn't want to face. You became proof that healing was possible, and that terrified them more than confrontation ever could. Because if you could rise from your pain, what excuse did they have left for staying in theirs? They couldn't manipulate you because you didn't need anything from them. Their approval stopped being your oxygen. Their disapproval stopped being your death sentence. You had nothing for them to feed on, and that's what destroyed their advantage. They wanted you reactive because reactivity is predictable. Wholeness isn't. A healed person doesn't play to win, they play to understand. You began to see through their motives, not take them personally. And once you could see through it, the power imbalance was gone. They realized too late that they weren't fighting a wounded version of you anymore. They were fighting someone who no longer needed to fight. And that's what they'll never understand, that peace isn't passivity. It's power that doesn't need to prove itself. You didn't win by overpowering them. You won by outgrowing the battlefield entirely. Their game ended the moment you refused to play from pain. Number 2, you threatened their economy of chaos. Their whole system thrived on emotional instability, not money, but energy. They knew how to create confusion and then feed off the reactions it caused. Every insult, every setup, every guilt trip was designed to get a rise out of you. That reaction was their profit. The more they could drain your peace, the more powerful they felt. But you did something they never expected. You stopped investing in their chaos. You cut off the supply chain, and without your energy to feed on, their entire system began to crumble. They depended on emotional drama to stay relevant. They didn't know how to exist in peace, because peace exposes how empty their power really is. That's why they always needed something going wrong, a crisis, a conflict, a misunderstanding. Without constant noise, they'd have to face their own silence, and that silence terrifies them. But you started operating on a higher frequency where confusion didn't have access. You began to respond instead of react. You started observing instead of absorbing. And that shift broke their entire cycle. They wanted to keep you emotionally overdrafted, always giving, explaining, proving, apologizing, chasing. They used guilt like currency, and for a long time, it worked. But when you woke up to how much peace you were losing trying to please chaos, you walked away from their system altogether. You stopped being their emotional ATM. You stopped financing dysfunction. And when you did that, they went bankrupt in spirit. Because without your attention, their drama lost its audience. They tried to label your calm as arrogance, your silence as weakness, and your distance as cruelty, because chaos can't understand boundaries. To them, emotional distance looks like betrayal, but to you, it was survival. You weren't rejecting them, you were reclaiming yourself. You realized peace doesn't need to announce itself, it just exists, quietly dismantling everything built on noise. That's what they'll never admit. They needed your energy more than you ever needed their approval. Their game wasn't about connection, it was about control. But you flipped it when you stopped trading your peace for temporary belonging. You showed them that when chaos is the currency, stability is rebellion. And in that quiet rebellion, you became untouchable. Number 3, you became the mirror they couldn't corrupt. They were used to reflections that agreed with their illusions, people who mirrored back the image they wanted to believe about themselves. They thrived on distortion, because distortion protects the ego. But you were different. You didn't bend, you didn't dim, and you didn't play along. Your presence reflected truth, and that truth was their undoing. You didn't have to expose them with words, your authenticity did it silently. Your stability showed their instability. Your honesty revealed their deceit. Your peace highlighted their inner war. That's why they couldn't stand you but couldn't look away either. They tried to project their flaws onto you because that's what the broken do. They transfer what they can't face. But you didn't receive it this time. You didn't absorb their blame, you didn't carry their shame, and that infuriated them. Because their manipulation only works when someone accepts it. The moment you refused to internalize their narrative, they lost their hold. You became the mirror that no longer reflected their fantasy. It showed their truth, unfiltered and unflattering. That's what made them lash out. They weren't fighting you. They were fighting the version of themselves that your energy revealed. Your wholeness disrupted their comfort. When people are used to dysfunction, honesty feels like an attack. You weren't attacking them. You were simply existing in clarity. But to those who live off lies, clarity burns. You didn't play superior or try to change them. You simply refused to join their confusion. That resistance alone felt like rejection to them. They mistook your authenticity for arrogance because in their world, only manipulation wins. The irony is that they wanted your light until they realized it showed their shadows. You became the mirror that forced them to see what healing would require: accountability, vulnerability, surrender. And those are things ego-driven people fear the most. You weren't their enemy. You were their opportunity to evolve. But instead of growing, they attacked the reflection. That's the curse of the unhealed. They destroy what reminds them of who they could be. You didn't break their heart, you broke their illusion. You didn't wound their spirit, you wounded their mask. And that's why they'll never forget you. You didn't reflect who they were pretending to be. You reflected who they truly were underneath it all. Number 4, you played without needing to win. That's what separated you from them. Their every move was about validation, about proving something, conquering something, or being seen as superior. Their sense of worth depended on coming out on top, even if it meant stepping on others or manipulating their way there. They played to survive because their identity was still attached to fear. Fear of not being enough, of losing control, of being forgotten. You, on the other hand, had already outgrown that mindset. You weren't chasing trophies. You were chasing transformation. You didn't need to win because you had already won the hardest battle: mastering yourself. That's what made you unpredictable. People who play to win are easy to manipulate. All you have to do is threaten their pride or dangle validation in front of them. But you couldn't be baited anymore. Their tactics lost their effect because your self-worth wasn't sitting on the scoreboard. You weren't competing with them. You were evolving beyond them. You were no longer trying to prove who you were. You were becoming who you were meant to be. And when someone reaches that level of inner clarity, the game ends before it even starts. They mistook your calm for disinterest, but it was mastery. You had learned that every fight comes with a cost: peace, time, and energy. You started choosing your battles based on purpose, not ego. They couldn't understand how someone could stay so centered while being provoked, because their entire existence revolved around reaction. You didn't respond to insults or manipulation, not because you didn't care, but because you finally understood how much energy it takes to prove something to people who are committed to misunderstanding you. That's what true power looks like, not in domination, but in detachment. You weren't trying to win against them. You were winning over yourself. You stopped needing to be right, to be chosen, or to be seen. And in that stillness, your peace became your victory. They wanted to play chess. You walked off the board. You realized the real win wasn't checkmate. It was freedom. You evolved from survival to sovereignty, and that's a game no one can beat you at. Number 5. They couldn't decipher a mind that wasn't addicted to pain. People who live unhealed build their identity around struggle. Pain becomes their compass, their language, their comfort zone. When you've spent your whole life surviving, peace can actually feel foreign, even threatening. That's the level they operated from. They didn't seek stability, they sought stimulation. As long as there was drama, tension, or emotional chaos, they felt alive. So when you showed up grounded, calm, and emotionally steady, it short-circuited their system. You weren't reacting the way pain-trained people do, and that made you unpredictable, something they couldn't study, bait, or manipulate. They tried to drag you into their emotional storms, because that's where they had home field advantage. But you stopped taking the bait. You learned that not every argument needs attendance, and not every attack deserves energy. You weren't ignoring them. You were evolving past the need to play their emotional games. They mistook that self-control for weakness, but it was actually power. You learned how to feel emotions without letting them hijack your logic. You could sit with discomfort without becoming it. That's what made you unprogrammable. You no longer responded to emotional triggers the way you used to. They couldn't understand how you could experience pain and still have peace. To them, healing meant denying or suppressing emotions. But you didn't suppress. You transformed. You let pain pass through instead of building a home in it. And that terrified them because it meant you had access to something they didn't. Clarity. Pain had always been their lens, but you saw life without distortion. You stopped identifying with your suffering, and that's when they lost all control. Because people who can sit in peace are harder to manipulate than people who need chaos to feel something. They'll never admit it, but your stability exposed their dependency. They weren't strong. They were addicted to drama, to pity, to victimhood. You broke that entire cycle by showing that strength isn't found in how much pain you can endure, but in how much peace you can maintain in the midst of it. You became a walking contradiction to their programming, and the moment you stopped being addicted to pain, you became the one thing they could never understand: free. Number 6, you mastered the art of detachment without disconnection. They couldn't comprehend it because, to them, emotional attachment has always meant ownership. They equate love with control and presence with access. When someone like you comes along, someone who can care deeply without losing themselves, it exposes how little they actually understand about real connection. You didn't detach because you stopped caring. You detached because you finally understood that peace and proximity aren't the same thing. You could love people and still know when their energy wasn't healthy for you. That kind of wisdom doesn't come from indifference. It comes from growth. They mistook your emotional discipline for arrogance, but it was actually balance. You had learned the hard way that constant access to you is a privilege, not a right. You stopped trying to heal people who were committed to staying broken. You stopped over-explaining your worth to those who were never listening. You stopped leaking your energy into relationships that only celebrated your weakness but resented your strength. Detachment for you became sacred self-respect, a quiet declaration that your peace would no longer be the price of connection. You didn't disappear. You just stopped showing up where your spirit wasn't valued. You stopped chasing closure, stopped demanding fairness, and stopped begging for reciprocity from people who lived off emotional debt. You realized that being available to everyone was slowly making you unavailable to yourself. So you rebalanced the scales. You began to show up intentionally, not habitually, and that shift confused them because their control depended on your constant emotional participation. The moment you withdrew that energy, their influence disappeared. Detachment doesn't mean you're cold. It means you're clear. It means you stopped performing emotional labor for people who never return it. It means you stopped trying to rescue those who choose their chaos over your calm. You still have love, just wiser love, one that no longer bleeds for validation. They couldn't understand that kind of strength because their power comes from reaction, not reflection. You played from wholeness, not need. You were connected without being consumed, loving without losing yourself. And that's what they couldn't stand. That your peace was so anchored, it didn't require their permission to exist. Number 7. Your calm was misread as weakness until it became their exposure. They genuinely believed that silence meant surrender, that stillness meant defeat. But what they never realized is that your restraint was not fear, it was foresight. You weren't frozen. You were focused. You understood something they didn't. Energy is the real currency of power. Every argument, every provocation, every trap they set was designed to pull you into emotional debt. The moment you refused to spend your peace on their nonsense, you became untouchable. They mistook your patience for passivity, not realizing that the longer you stayed calm, the more they revealed themselves. Their entire strategy depended on your reaction. Manipulators need movement. They need you to defend, to explain, to protest, to plead. That's how they twist narratives and control perception. But you did the opposite. You stayed grounded, centered, observant. You watched their patterns expose themselves while they mistook your silence for ignorance. They didn't realize that stillness doesn't mean blindness. It means you've chosen to see without speaking. Your calm became the light that made their shadows visible. The more you refused to react, the louder their intentions became. What they called weakness was actually emotional mastery. You knew that chaos feeds on participation. Every time you refused to engage, you took oxygen from their drama. And eventually, the fire they started burned out, not because you fought it, but because you refused to fan it. You weren't playing the same game anymore. You stopped giving your energy to situations that didn't evolve you. You realized that real power doesn't chase validation or explanation. It simply allows truth to reveal itself. And that's exactly what happened. Your calm became the mirror that exposed their manipulation, their insecurity, and their desperation for control. It forced them to face their own noise in the silence you left behind. The irony is, they were so busy trying to trigger you that they ended up triggering themselves. Every scheme they launched died because you gave it no energy to feed on. That's when they realized the one they thought was weak was actually the one holding all the power. You dismantled them without lifting a hand, simply by refusing to match their chaos. Your peace wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Number 8. You rewrote the rules by refusing to bleed publicly. They were waiting for your breakdown. They needed it. Their entire power came from convincing others that you were unstable, emotional, or fragile. They set traps that were meant to make you react in front of an audience, because if they could get you to unravel publicly, they could control the story. That's how manipulators win. Not through truth, but through spectacle. But you changed the script. You chose silence over chaos, solitude over sympathy, and reflection over retaliation. You didn't give them the scene they were hoping for. You didn't give them the satisfaction of watching you fall apart. You healed where no one could interfere, in secret. They expected you to fight for attention, to explain yourself, to prove your innocence. Instead, you went invisible for a while. Not because you were defeated, but because you understood that healing is sacred work, and sacred work doesn't need an audience. You let the truth mature in silence. You processed your pain without broadcasting it. You turned your wounds into wisdom behind closed doors while they kept performing in public, desperate to stay relevant. They didn't realize that the one who disappears to heal always returns transformed. When you re-emerged, your peace confused them. You were supposed to be broken, bitter, begging for validation. But you came back glowing with self-awareness and groundedness. That's what shook them. You proved that strength isn't loud, it's consistent. You didn't post your pain, you processed it. You didn't announce your growth, you embodied it. And that quiet evolution spoke louder than anything they could ever say. They underestimated how powerful privacy can be. When you heal in silence, you protect your energy from contamination. No one can twist what they can't see. You stopped feeding their gossip with your reactions. You stopped correcting their lies with your presence. And without your participation, their narrative fell apart. Their need for drama became obvious to everyone. Your calm became credibility. Your peace became proof. By refusing to bleed publicly, you reclaimed control over your story. You didn't need pity, you needed power. And that's exactly what you found. You didn't just heal. You redefined what healing looks like. You showed that sometimes the loudest comeback is quiet restoration. Number 9. They were fluent in fear, but you spoke the language of truth. Fear was their first language, manipulation their dialect. They knew how to twist words, rewrite facts, and plant seeds of doubt until people couldn't trust their own perception. That's how they maintained control. They didn't need to be right, they only needed to make you question yourself. The moment you began to overthink, they had already won. Their power came from confusion, keeping you trapped in emotional fog so you'd depend on them for clarity. But then something shifted. You stopped chasing approval and started chasing truth. And truth doesn't need to shout. It just stands there, steady, until the lies collapse around it. They thrived in distortion because that's where fear lives. Fear doesn't need evidence, it just needs repetition. They repeated false narratives, exaggerated your mistakes, and minimized your worth until you almost forgot who you were. But the thing about truth is, it can't stay buried forever. Deep down, your spirit knew what was real, even when your mind was doubting it. You began to trust that inner voice, the one they couldn't edit. That's when their entire structure began to crack. They could manipulate your thoughts, but they could never touch your knowing. You learned to separate emotion from intuition. You stopped letting fear write your reality. Instead of reacting, you started discerning. You began to feel your emotions without letting them dictate your decisions. That's where your freedom started. Because once truth takes root, fear loses its grip. Their lies stopped working because you stopped needing their version of the story. You stopped negotiating with confusion and started standing in clarity. And that made you impossible to control. They were fluent in fear because that's all they've ever known. They need others to feel small so they can feel significant. But you stopped speaking that language. You stopped translating your peace to fit their insecurity. You realized that fear controls, but truth liberates. And when you chose truth, even when it hurt, even when it was lonely, everything false began to fall away. They could lie to the world, they could twist narratives, but they couldn't rewrite your spirit. Truth doesn't just protect you, it purifies you. And once you spoke its language, manipulation lost all power over you. Number 10. You didn't seek revenge. You became evolution. That's what they'll never understand. They were expecting retaliation, a response, some kind of emotional eruption that would justify their narrative of you. They needed you to mirror their dysfunction so they could feel justified in theirs. But you didn't. You stopped matching their energy and started mastering your own. You realized that revenge keeps you tied to the same vibration that hurt you, and you refused to live on that frequency anymore. You weren't trying to hurt them. You were too busy healing yourself. And that shift changed everything. They built traps made of ego, hoping you'd step into them by trying to prove a point. But you started seeing the bigger picture, that revenge is just pain trying to recycle itself. You understood that if you fought them on their level, you'd lose, even if you won, because you'd still be playing the same game that once drained you. So you took the higher route, not because you were weak, but because you were wise. You redirected all that energy into your growth, your peace, your purpose. And slowly, your evolution became the very thing they couldn't compete with. They expected you to come back with anger, but you came back with alignment. They thought they broke you, but they only cracked open the version of you that was still seeking validation. You turned their betrayal into your breakthrough. Every wound they caused became a place for wisdom to live. And that's what frustrated them the most, that the very pain they designed to destroy you ended up becoming your initiation into higher consciousness. You didn't just move on, you moved up. The irony is, your healing became their exposure. They had built entire stories around your pain, but once you evolved, those stories stopped making sense. The healed you didn't fit the image they tried to sell. Your growth rewrote the narrative without you ever saying a word. And that's the ultimate revenge, to rise so high that they have to stretch their reality just to keep up with the truth of who you've become. You didn't retaliate, you elevated. You didn't destroy them, you outgrew them. And in that quiet, undeniable transformation, you became the one thing their ego could never conquer: evolution itself. Number 11. You exposed that trauma was their only strategy. Every move they made came from pain, not power. They built their sense of control on emotional manipulation because that's the only language their wounds knew how to speak. They weren't strong, they were scared. But they disguised that fear behind arrogance, gossip, and dominance so no one would see how hollow they really were inside. Once you recognized that their power was just the recycled energy of their own unhealed suffering, they stopped being intimidating. You realized you were never at war with a person. You were confronting the echo of their trauma, trying desperately to stay alive through you. They learned early that pain equals attention, and attention equals control. So they used guilt, shame, and projection to keep others trapped in emotional chaos. That's all they knew: trauma as a weapon, dysfunction as communication, conflict as validation. But once you became self-aware, their tactics lost oxygen. You stopped feeding the very system that sustained their illusion of authority. You started to see that they weren't masterminds. They were prisoners of their own unresolved history, replaying it on anyone who reminded them of their unhealed parts. And that's when the whole game fell apart. The moment you saw through the manipulation, you stopped responding emotionally. And that's the one thing trauma-based control can't survive: neutrality. You didn't need to fight them, you just needed to see them clearly. You realized that pathology doesn't adapt, it repeats. It's predictable, mechanical, robotic. It can only operate on confusion and fear, and once you refused to provide either, it had no power left. That's when you understood the deeper truth. They never wanted connection. They wanted control. But control built on fear is always temporary. You broke the chain the moment you decided to heal instead of react. Because healing ends cycles. It doesn't just escape them. You showed that real strength isn't about overpowering others. It's about mastering yourself. And in doing so, you exposed everything they tried to hide. Their entire identity depended on everyone staying unhealed. But once you found yourself, the illusion collapsed. You didn't just survive their trauma. You decoded it. And once you did, you became immune to it forever. Number 12. You played from awareness, not from wounds. They reacted, you responded. They moved from pain, you moved from presence. They played emotionally, while you played energetically, at a level they couldn't even perceive. You were aware of the unseen forces behind people's actions, the subtle frequencies behind their words. That's why you could sit calmly while others tried to trigger you. You weren't trying to win the argument. You were studying the energy. You knew the real game wasn't about who was right, but who was conscious. They were still operating from their survival brain, running on old programming, unresolved emotions, and generational pain. To them, conflict felt like oxygen because that's what their nervous system was trained to crave. But you refused to participate in the same way. You didn't suppress emotion. You mastered it. You learned that awareness is what separates evolution from reaction. Awareness gave you options where others only saw instinct. You could see the pattern unfolding before it even began, and because of that, you no longer played by their rules. That's why they couldn't predict your moves. Your actions weren't emotional reactions. They were conscious decisions. You saw through manipulation because you understood motive. You didn't chase validation because you already knew who you were. You didn't need to prove your worth because awareness had already made you free. That's what made your energy unsettling to them. They couldn't read you through the lens of their trauma. They were fluent in chaos, But your peace was another language entirely. True power has nothing to do with dominance. It's the ability to stay grounded in truth when everyone else is lost in illusion. You mastered that. You understood that emotional intelligence is not weakness. It's wisdom disguised as calm. You didn't need to control anyone because you had already mastered control over yourself. And that's the kind of authority no system can corrupt. While they played from wounds, you played from wholeness. And wholeness doesn't compete, it transforms. Your every choice became a mirror exposing who was conscious and who was still asleep. And that's why you always won, even without trying, because you weren't playing the same game. You were playing for evolution, not validation. Number 13. You revealed that healing was the real revolution. They mocked your stillness because they mistook it for surrender, not realizing that healing is the most disruptive act in a world addicted to dysfunction. They thought you were retreating, but you were reprogramming. They thought you were losing power, but you were reclaiming it from every emotional debt ever attached to your name. Healing is not gentle, it's surgical. It cuts through illusions, dismantles inherited pain, and forces the system built on trauma to malfunction. That's why your peace was never welcome, because it interrupted their chaos economy. They laughed at healing because it doesn't look dramatic. It's not loud, it doesn't demand applause, and it doesn't perform pain for sympathy. But while they were busy rehearsing their victimhood, you were rewriting your DNA. You stopped being the emotional power source that kept the old cycles alive. Every moment you chose forgiveness over bitterness, you weakened the architecture of control. Every boundary you set without rage short-circuited manipulation. You didn't just walk away healed, you walked away rewired. Healing became your form of rebellion because it exposed how much of society is structured around unhealed people seeking control. Entire hierarchies collapse when one person refuses to repeat the same pain patterns. You became that person. You didn't fight back with anger. You dismantled the very energy that gave them authority. You stopped mirroring pain and started embodying wholeness. And that's what broke the system. The world doesn't know how to handle someone who doesn't need saving, fixing, or approval. And the irony is, healing made you more powerful than revenge ever could. Revenge satisfies the ego, but healing liberates the soul. You didn't just recover, you evolved. You became the glitch in the program, the soul that refused to stay scripted. Every time you healed, the old narrative lost one of its storytellers. That's what frightened them, that your inner peace was contagious. You didn't just heal for yourself, you healed for the entire lineage. And once you did, every manipulator, every system, every structure built on pain began to lose its power. Because healing isn't passive, it's the quiet revolution that redefines what it means to win. Number 14. You didn't just end the game, you ended the cycle. Every game needs two players to exist, and you refused to play. That's when everything started collapsing. The traps they set suddenly stopped catching anything because your spirit no longer resonated with the vibration that powered them. You didn't win by outsmarting them. You won by outgrowing them. You evolved beyond the frequency of conflict. And that's the thing about true healing. It doesn't destroy darkness through war. It simply outshines it until it has nothing left to feed on. They kept trying to bait you with the same emotional hooks, guilt, fear, shame. But your energy had moved on. You no longer operated from wounds that needed defending, so their games couldn't reach you. They were fighting ghosts from your old identity, but that version of you no longer existed. That's when you realize something profound. Trauma repeats itself until someone becomes conscious enough to stop responding to it. You became that consciousness. You broke the loop not through resistance, but through recognition. Wholeness changes the frequency of the battlefield. It makes manipulation ineffective, drama uninteresting, and control impossible. They called it arrogance because they couldn't process peace that wasn't performative. But your calm wasn't arrogance. It was evolution. You had become untriggerable, not because you didn't feel, but because you no longer confused emotion with identity. You could witness chaos without merging with it. You could see pain without personalizing it. That's mastery, and it's the one thing they never expected you to achieve. When you ended the cycle, you didn't just free yourself, you freed everyone connected to that story. Because when one person stops feeding generational pain, the ripple travels backward and forward through time. You became the closure your bloodline never received. You ended battles your ancestors were forced to fight in silence. You closed portals of pain disguised as family patterns, relationships, and trauma bonds. Ending the game was never about revenge. It was about evolution. And evolution doesn't announce itself. It simply makes the old obsolete. You didn't destroy the darkness. You just stopped agreeing to dance with it. That's the quiet kind of victory only the healed ever experience. The kind that doesn't need validation because the freedom speaks for itself. You lived through the storms they built from trauma and emerged not just unbroken, but transformed. Every attempt to control you, manipulate you, or drain your energy was met with something they couldn't predict: wholeness. You didn't react from wounds, you moved from awareness. You didn't fight to prove a point, you healed to evolve. Every trap, every lie, every strategy designed to keep you small was dismantled, not by anger, not by vengeance, but by your own clarity, discipline, and mastery over self. You became the mirror they feared, the calm they misread as weakness, and the truth they couldn't distort. You exposed that their strength was borrowed from dysfunction, and that real power comes from mastery over self, not domination over others. You revealed that healing is not passive. It's the most radical form of resistance. You showed that peace is not surrender. It's the ultimate strategy. You didn't just survive their games. You outgrew them, rendering their tactics obsolete. You became the embodiment of evolution, proof that trauma cannot define a soul that refuses to be owned. Every wound you healed, every boundary you set, every moment you chose growth over reaction became a seal on the cycles they tried to trap you in. You didn't just end their game, you ended the cycle itself. This is what it means to play from wholeness. It's not about proving anyone wrong or winning on their terms. It's about transcending the rules that were written in fear and chaos and creating a reality where your presence alone shifts the energy of the room. It's about turning every attack into a lesson, every betrayal into initiation, and every challenge into a stepping stone toward mastery. You are living proof that light doesn't fight darkness. It simply makes it irrelevant. You are the evolution that they never saw coming. If this resonated with you, and you're ready to continue stepping into your power, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss content that awakens, empowers, and transforms. Like this video to honor your growth, comment below to share your own journey of rising above trauma, and share this with someone who needs to see the path from survival to wholeness. Your energy, your voice, and your story matter, and together we keep breaking the cycles and redefining what it truly means to be unstoppable. God bless you.